Welcome to the 155th edition of Europe Calling. My name is Maximilian Fries. I'm the Managing Director of Europe Calling, and a special welcome to our guest speakers who I shall introduce in a moment. As always, with Europe Calling, I would like to give you some technical information up front. As always, you can ask your questions and rate the questions of others. You will be using Slido for this. You will see the link in the chat and on the slide. Feel free to ask your questions there and rate them. The rating is very important because we have 2,500 registrations tonight. And this is the only way we can ask the questions that interest you. And very important, please do write your name down. It's much nicer than because I won't have to say an anonymous user says or asks. When you click on the link, you can choose your language, and later on I shall select questions in English and in German. As always, Europe Calling will be recorded and subsequently uploaded onto YouTube. And now we would like to get going. Let me say a few words by ways of introduction. Today, the two-week UN Climate Change Conference began in Bonn. It is the preparation of the content and the stock-taking for the next climate conference in Dubai. And I'd like to cite the UN Climate Secretary Simon Stiel. He said, for many people around the world, limiting our planet's warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius is a matter of survival. The global stocktake is a generation's chance to correct the course we have taken and find a way to address climate change with renewed vigor and perspective. And at the same, and 7 of 8 of the limits have been trespassed. So we really need to do something. We need to find a new dynamic, but at the same time, we see in Brussels and elsewhere that the resistance is extremely strong. And it is even growing from conservatives and right-wing representatives against the European Green Deal, or in Germany against the heating legislation. Then we need to really consider all the alternatives that are being pushed, and we need to reflect on who stands behind all these alternative moves. And that's why I'm very happy to welcome our first guest, Annika Joeres, who's a climate journalist for Die ZEIT and Correctiv, and together with Susanne Götze, she authored a book on, and we will be hearing from her how politicians and business leaders manipulate the policy. Thanks very much. Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here tonight. And I think that it is a it's a highly interesting title that the webinar offers. And I would like to share my screen with you right now. I think I can go ahead, right? Okay, now it's coming. So I'll be giving you just a very short input because we're so many panelists and we would like it to enter into a debate with everyone in this room. This is the book that I wrote together with Susanne Götze, who is a journalist with Der Spiegel. And we wrote this book because we'd been researching climate change for a few years, and we asked ourselves the question, why is so little being done? And that is probably the question that a lot of people put to themselves, because if you take stock of for how many years the debate has been going on, then you really logically come to that question. This is the timeline when it all started coming up, this debate, that we realized that the greenhouse gas emissions needed to be limited and reduced in order to survive on this planet. It's over 50 years ago that the Club of Rome warned us and said, hey, we can't just go on like that. And between those dots, you have a number of other stages of climate protection negotiations. There's also the 2015 climate convention, the framework convention on climate change, where we all agreed that the warming, global warming should be kept under 2 degrees centigrade, but we still find from the graph that those greenhouse gas emissions simply went up all the time, and not one country that adopted the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change has yet submitted a plan or entered into a policy which would allow it to keep the global warming at the level agreed in the convention. And that is why we wrote the book. Could you perhaps blow this up a little bit, Annika?
Auf Windows hatte ich gesagt F5, aber
if it was Windows, I would suggest using F5. Does that also work? Underneath the Klimaschmutzlobby, you see the play further to the left.
Unter Klimaschmutzlobby, sorry.
Just underneath the title, Klimaschmutzlobby. It looks perfectly all right for me, so I don't really know what you mean, Max. Do you see the title of your presentation? Right on the top, it says Klimaschmutzlobby. Okay, now you're beneath it, and then you use the left button from that. Okay, well then just carry on. Just carry on. Okay, I should think that the words are large enough for you all to follow. So we asked ourselves, how is it possible that in 30 years, so little was done? The world should be aware and must be aware of what's going on climate-wise. And we identified 3 big groups who are more or less responsible: the deniers of the climate change, the skeptics, then the right-wing extremists, and then the group which Susanne and I called those putting their foot on the brake. And they're well known in Brussels, Paris, London, and Berlin. But in the long term, we'll be looking at those having their foot on the brake. Let me briefly come to the first group. It is not such a group making a lot of noise any longer in Germany, perhaps in the US and perhaps in Brazil. They're still very active, but of course they did cause some damage in the society. Those are the people who are in denial of climate change. These can be public figures or private persons. They simply claim there is no climate change, or they will pretend that there is a climate change, but it's a rather positive development because it's quite nice to have a little warmer weather. So they simply deny the results of scientific research. And what follows on, of course, is if you deny climate change, then you don't need a climate action. And this poisons the debate and has poisoned it for a very long time, for at least 2 decades, perhaps. And it carries on like that in other parts in the world. It simply stops short any debate on the climate change. And it explains why so many people think that you don't need a climate action. Many so-called scientific conferences take place in Portugal, for example. We participated in one of these conferences of the Hartfield Institute, and there's another institute active in Germany that would organize such conferences. EIKE, it is called, and I would say they're elderly men, hardly any women among them, one or two perhaps, but those would be the typical representatives of this group of people being in denial of climate change. The second group, which is also very closely linked to those deniers, are the right-wing extremists and populists. And that would be in Germany the members of the AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, or the Rassemblement National in France. They claim that it is an exaggeration what people portray as climate change. They say that we have other problems that we should be looking at and trying to come to terms with, but climate change in itself is not a relevant problem. And this is yet another example. The media also portray these views. Compact and Breitbart in the US, in Germany it would be Compact, in the US Breitbart. Everything is just one big lie, and the scientists are utterly wrong. And these people, these groups have many followers, certainly in the United States, perhaps not so many in Europe, but they just don't die out. And they do have readers, and they're just distributing fake news and are very, very close, very often to the right-wing extremists or populists. The third group, to us, seems to be the most important group because they're very close to the spheres of power. In Germany and in France, that would be people not quite in the government, but you also would find quite a few people standing on the brakes in a parliament and even in the European Parliament. And you'll find them, you'll meet them in your local grocery shop, and they will say, okay, yes, admittedly, climate change exists, but climate action cannot be pursued in a very aggressive way or fast because other considerations need to be taken on board first. And you find all these people very often also in think tanks and other groups. And I think Christina Denkwirt will also be talking about that, because those are the lobbyists who are very influential in our present day. I have listed three arguments that they very often offer. I called them the neoliberal eminences. They simply don't want any intrusion into the way they do business or into the economic structures. They're used to the present rules of the game, and they don't want any changes. They don't want to accept any changes here. So that's why we call them the neoliberal eminences. They don't want any political interference, and they will say, due to the cost and job concerns, we mustn't rush towards climate action. And then they say, if push comes to shove, a technical solution will be available. Then they will also say that climate action in the economy can only work on a global level. And that's the link to the carbon leakage debate. And they simply feel that this wouldn't really solve the a climate crisis. So they very often believe in geoengineering and other technical solutions, but they don't understand that the solution won't really help the entire population. And then point C is what I've already mentioned. They really don't want an interference from the state. The point says that the market will sort it out. And as I said before, the next point is their argument that climate action in the economy can only work on a global level and not on a local level. So those are the favorite arguments against climate action. Here you can see how these things work. Very often think tanks are present. They publish theses, academic papers, studies, and brochures. And the Nord Stream pipeline, for example, requested many different studies, and then the results are taken up by the media. But they tend to forget that industry ordered these studies, and that the perspective was the perspective of the Nord Stream pipeline, for example. The fact that would then appear that the gas pipeline is a very, very positive development. And it is neglected in the media who the initiator of the study was. So not enough questions are raised. The background of those papers, of those theses, of those brochures is not clearly transparent and looked at, and therefore, whatever the results were, they might have a very negative impact on the climate debate. This is an overview on the way it works at the level of parliaments. Very, very often, huge numbers of lobbyists are present around a parliament. If you've ever been to Brussels and you look at the streets around the Brussels Parliament, the European Parliament in Brussels, then you'll find that they're all present there. The business representatives, the farmers associations, around 12,000 lobbyists are present in Brussels in huge numbers, but the environmental NGOs or the climate action NGOs have very few people only in Brussels trying to influence the political direction. There's another example from the German Parliament. The Committee on Agriculture, for example, for a very, very long time had a vast majority of its members working in a very traditional, conventional agriculture. And many of them were, on top of that, actively engaged in farmers' associations, which might explain why we still have such huge problems in agriculture. And let me come to the last example. We had an exchange of correspondence between Airbus and the European Commission, and they were talking about the threshold values for aircraft manufacturing. And Airbus was asked by the Commission, what are your red lines? What could we put into the legislative act? What would be convenient for you? So there was a direct agreement struck between industry and the European Commission for that particular piece of legislation, and it was adopted. So That was the fast forward into this subject, and this is just a small sketch towards the end of my presentation. We don't make any progress because perhaps the climate crisis is being discussed amongst politicians, but also amongst journalists. And everyone wonders, how can we make the general public more aware of that? And then lobbyists simply interfere and distract everyone else from the cause. It is very, very, very difficult to actually raise awareness with just offering graphs. And it's not quite as shocking as having a bear appear all of a sudden out of the woods. Thanks for your attention, and I think I'll give the floor to the next one.
Du hast schon viele wichtige Punkte angesprochen. Ganz herzlichen Dank für diesen Einstieg jetzt. Und dann gehen wir jetzt auch direkt weiter. Da war eine Dolmetscher.
Thank you. And that's a lot of important points. Jennie King is our next speaker. She's head of climate science and policy at the prestigious Institute for Strategic Dialogue, ISD, in London. And if you're familiar with this area, you'll know her for her analysis of the digital disinformation strategies of the anti-climate lobby. I think it was May or March this year that she was at the European Parliament, a major hearing where she talked about the same topic. So Jennie, we're looking forward to your talk. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. Can you see my screen, Max?
Yes, we can.
All good. Okay, fantastic. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the dynamics of mis and disinformation and why they pose such a serious threat to achieving progress on climate action, but also why those dynamics are particularly acute at this moment in time. What is happening in our broader social environment, political environment, the way that we connect to information and to particularly online platforms that make it so difficult for us to have a collective, sober conversation about the net zero transition. And what is the role that industry players and the fossil fuel industry in particular plays in enabling that ecosystem. And the very first thing that I wanted to start with is this diagram that shows why, from my perspective, mis and disinformation is having its optimum moment. At ISD, we often talk about the fact that these phenomena, so mis and disinformation, they thrive in moments of crisis and in moments of uncertainty. And at the moment, we are living through essentially 5 or 6 or 7 intersecting crises that are all reinforcing each other and are creating the most fertile soil that we have probably seen in our lifetimes for false and misleading content to spread through populations and also to resonate with members of the public. I don't think I need to go into all of these in great detail, but I will say that from an organization who works on extremism and disinformation and hate, we would say that COVID-19 was a radicalizing event. It was a turbocharging event for all of those phenomena. And what I mean by that is that new communities came into contact with each other. Trust in institutions was eroded to a historic level. There was a sense of personal trauma experienced by billions of people around the globe that is really easily exploited by bad actors and moved beyond public health into other issue areas. And also it was a time when people were extremely online because they didn't have any other option. They weren't able to socialize. They weren't able to engage with information in the other more traditional ways. They were living almost exclusively through social media and other forms of mediated interaction. On top of that, you then had the aftershocks of the pandemic, and in particular, the cost of living crisis, and the cost of living crisis as a continuation of an existing trend, which is the enormous wealth inequality that is being experienced in most countries around the globe. And what that does in terms of people's own perception of their power, their agency in comparison to governments and to institutions and to elites. And then on top of that, you had Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Now, of course, they had various military incursions into Georgia and into the Donbass for a number of years, but the outright invasion sent enormous repercussions, both through the geopolitical landscape globally, but also it put enormous pressure on energy supply chains and more broadly on consumer trends. And all of those things have, as I said, created the perfect environment, the perfect conditions for the kinds of mis and disinformation that were already existing to reach the kind of maximum exposure and engagement within the general public. Next thing I wanted to say, I often get asked the question, how does mis and disinformation around climate change differ from other issue sets? So we know that it is by no means the only victim of this trend, and that whether it's COVID and what happened with public health and vaccine regimes, whether it's people doubting the results of elections and what we've seen play out in the US with kind of false and unsubstantiated claims of election fraud, whether it's false information about migration and the effect that that's having on societies, whether it's about racial justice or the LGBTQ movement, mis and disinformation is an ever-present reality in almost every public policy area. So is climate different? Are there any unique factors about it that we should be aware of when we're thinking about a response? And I would say both yes and no. The thing that really distinguishes climate mis and disinformation is that it has a legacy going all the way back to the 1970s with an enormous amount of corporate funding behind it. And what that means is that there is a professionalized sector who have been employed to work on and spread and hone the messages for climate mis and disinformation for decades. And that does differ from other areas that feel a lot more organic or grassroots. So it is still the case to this day that billions of dollars are invested every year, either directly from oil and gas companies or through their vast network of lobby groups, front groups, PR agencies, advertising agencies, in order to influence public opinion and to put forward a very specific agenda about how societies should or should not deal with climate change. And off the back of that, you also have a professional sector of think tanks, so-called academics, commentators who spent years cultivating a very particular brand so that they are seen as being credible in the public sphere, and they get a lot of platform in media outlets, as Annika was saying in her presentation, but they are ultimately either on the direct payroll of the fossil fuel industry, or they in some way also have vested interests and benefit from the maintenance of the carbon economy. So generally speaking, there is a lot more financial stakeholders that are operating within the climate space relative to other issue sets. And there is a lot more of a history of testing messages, trialing different forms of dissemination into the public and kind of throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks until you have the most powerful, most convincing messages, both for policymakers and legislators, but also for voters and general members of the public. The areas where it's similar and where we've really seen a huge shift in the climate space is that previously this conversation was relatively niche. And what I mean by that is there were plenty of people who were very committed to climate denial or to preventing climate action. But in lots of ways, it was quite an insular space. So it was specialists talking to specialists, or it was, anti-climate lobby talking to the environmental movement, but they were relatively isolated from the general public. And what's happened in the last 5 years or so is that climate has become a central pillar of what's often referred to as the culture wars. And what that means is that you're no longer talking about climate policy on its own merits, you're talking about it from the perspective of partisan politics, identity politics, and the idea that climate action as a whole is illegitimate because it's part of the woke agenda. And what that means is that things which started out as fossil fuel messaging and might have come originally from, Exxon and Shell in the 1980s and the 1990s is actually now being spread organically and in a far more decentralized way by a vast network of digital influencers and people who make their money off what we call the outrage economy online. So basically professional misinformers or professional pundits that have a very particular brand in the online space and who have seen climate as a way of building their reputation, of increasing their audience, and ultimately increasing engagement with their content, which helps them to generate revenue. And that is very similar to what we've seen happen in other spaces. What that means, and what we are seeing increasingly, is that climate mis and disinformation does not exist in a bubble. You will almost always find that the high traction accounts spreading this content, spreading denial, spreading delayism, spreading other forms of kind of laundered fossil fuel narratives, they will more often than not also be COVID skeptics, or they will be denying the results of an election, or at the very extreme end, they might believe in conspiracies like QAnon, or they might be advocating Holocaust denial, or they might be, highly opposed to conversations around gender identity. So there is a real kind of mixing and matching of all of these different conspiracist and extremist ideologies, which are becoming part of a unified worldview. And actually, we're not talking about environmentalism at all. We're talking about the woke agenda. We're talking about average citizens versus the state. We're talking about global elites versus the average working person, etc. And then just another couple of elements that I would highlight, which I do think are very similar, is, more and more you see that memes and videos are actually more important than text-based posts. And the benefit of doing things via memes is, firstly, they have huge viral potential, so they can spread like wildfire within a few hours, but also they overcome the language barrier. So they spread transnationally much faster than text-based mis and disinformation would. And they're also a lot harder to track using the standard tools that we have at our disposal for analyzing social media. Some of the other aspects are this idea of repetition. And you will see this, I'm sure anyone who's come across a conspiracy theory is that you push the same lines over and over again. And you basically flood the zone with content until you create the impression that that is public opinion. So someone who's on Twitter will see these dedicated voices who are such frequent posters and they're such vocal and passionate posters that unless you're really paying attention, you would think, oh, that must be general public opinion. It must be the case that the majority of my peers don't believe that climate change exists. But it's actually just because they're the loudest and most dedicated people in the room. And that's a very good tactic within the mis and disinformation playbook. And what undergirds all of this is a fundamental mistrust of institutions and fear-mongering or claims that there is some shadowy plot in order to control the average people and populations that is being implemented by a set of global elites. And depending on the conspiracy theory, that could be the UN, it could be the World Health Organization, it could be the World Economic Forum, but it always comes back to the same central idea, which is we don't believe in climate change, not because of the climate science, but because anyone who's a climate scientist is on the payroll of the global elites and they're trying to enact a form of tyranny and authoritarianism. So it's a very different form of denialism from what we would have seen in the 1970s and the 1980s. I'm really quickly going to touch upon this diagram, and then I will share a link with Max that he can hopefully put in the chat about the evolution that we've had away from denialism. So climate change doesn't exist, through to these discourses of delay. And what I mean by that is exploiting the gap between somebody who believes in climate change and actually implementing meaningful policies to deal with climate change. And I often refer to that gap as the final mile. We're existing at a moment in time where actually there is broad public consensus about the reality of climate change and the need to deal with it. But there's a huge way to go between that recognition and actually having policy agendas that match the Paris Agreement and net zero targets. And at the moment, that's where the investment is coming from the fossil fuel industry and from those with vested interests, is in delaying action to the extent that we never really gain momentum to deal with the problem. And in particular, from the industrial point of view, I would say these items on the far right are the most pertinent. So, claims that we're going to invent some technology which is going to suck all of the carbon out of the atmosphere. And as a result, we actually don't need to change any of our systems. We don't need to phase out fossil fuels. We don't need to change consumer behavior. We don't need to think about our infrastructure. We'll just come up with some silver bullet solution that will solve everything. Equally, the idea that any form of net zero agenda is going to make people's lives worse. And so it's better to stick with the status quo. All of these kind of arguments that really plant the seed of doubt in people's minds enough that we never move forward. And that takes, and this is the link that I'll put in the chat, but there is a fantastic comic version, comic, not funny, comic as in illustrated, version of this academic diagram that was made by a lady called Celine Keller. And it's a fantastic summary of the kinds of arguments that you come across and why they are so convincing, but also why they are misleading. So I recommend anyone to look at that. And this is going to take me on to the final points that I want to make, which is, even though we're living in this culture wars moment where plenty of people are spreading mis and disinformation without funding from a fossil fuel company, what are the fossil fuel industry doing? Because we know that they haven't switched off. It's not like they've said, oh, our work is done. If anything, they are funding media outlets who've made climate a culture wars issue, and they are still highly invested in forms of public influence campaigning and information operations. And these two reports are the big flagship research that has been produced by ISD and our coalition in the last couple of years that really maps the landscape across social media. So the first thing I want to show is just, this is the tip of the iceberg in highlighting the scale of investment that companies are making. So in 2021, we had a partner that did a study and they looked at 16 of the carbon major companies. Now, carbon majors are the oil and gas companies or fossil fuel companies who are responsible for an estimated 80% of all historic carbon emissions. So, these are the main perpetrators of climate change. And we looked at 16 of those companies and we found that in 3/4 of the year, they had 1,700 ads that were running just on Facebook and Instagram. So that's one company. And it's also only the adverts that we could find. And that earned around $5 million of revenue for Meta, so for Facebook and Instagram. So they are actually profiting off the spreading of greenwashing and climate mis and disinformation. All of those ads, were ads that contained substantiated false claims. So claims that had been debunked, claims that were misleading, claims that would misinform the consumer or the average citizen about the realities and the solutions to climate change. We ran a similar study in 2022, but just around the COP27 climate summit. So we're talking about a 2 to 3 month period immediately before the summit and during the summit, again, on one platform, just Facebook and Instagram. And we found that, that there were nearly 4,000 ads from fossil fuel linked entities during that time. And again, that had earned $3 to $4 million for Meta. So at the point in the year where there is the most public attention and visibility for climate issues, this is the kind of money that they are bringing to the table. And I can tell you, the climate sector does not have this kind of money. the industry is operating at a different order of magnitude in terms of the spending capability that it has at its disposal. And there's just a selection of some of the ads on the side here. So, you know, some of it is talking about companies as being climate champions. Some of it is more specifically, you know, pushing things like fossil gas and saying that it's a clean energy solution. Other things are, you know, petrochemical states talking about their green initiatives. Some of it is promoting really unsubstantiated technologies like carbon capture and storage. So it's a real mix of content. And I just wanted to highlight one really interesting factor, which is more and more, the most prolific advertisers that are using social media are not the companies themselves. They are proxy groups operating on behalf of the companies. And the reason why that's a problem is because it makes it even more difficult for a member of the public or a user of those platforms to know that this is sponsored content. So, you know, the American Petroleum Institute, okay, it at least has petroleum in the title, but that's actually, they fund a group called Energy Citizens, which sounds like it's grassroots. It sounds like it's citizen-led, and that maybe it was created by your neighbor, but it wasn't. It was funded by the oil and gas companies in the US. And increasingly, those are the names of the entities. You can see here, these are the top 10 by frequency and by spend. Natural Allies for a Clean Energy Future, Americans for Prosperity, the Empowerment Alliance. So it's using this language that seems to distance it from big industry and corporations, and therefore creates the impression in people's minds that it's trustworthy and worth paying attention to. And alongside that, this is, you know, just a fascinating adaptation to the modern environment, but we also see companies more and more working through digital influencers. So, you know, a couple of years ago, there was a great story that showed companies were paying Instagram influencers to kind of pose in front of gas stations. So these were people with massive organic reach who would say things like, oh, you know, I love filling up my car at this, and I'm a beautiful general member of the public in the US, and or I'm a yoga influencer or a wellness influencer, but also I love my gas stove and I love my petrol car. And more recently, there's been a huge uptick in this around the gas industry in the US. And these are just 3 pieces by Mother Jones, the New York Times, and Vox that have tracked the way that they're using these gatekeepers who people trust in order to influence public opinion. And at the same time, they're changing the language so that you have all of these things around independence, freedom, human flourishing. So it's not about oil and pollution and gas and fossil fuels, but instead it's about agency and power and average people living the best versions of their lives and prosperity. So, you know, very emotive language that can convince people. And then finally, this is where I wanted to end, is with a question, which I really hope we can pick up in the Q&A, which is, very often when we're talking about advertising products and services, people will say, well, why is it a problem for ExxonMobil or for Shell or for Saudi Aramco to have an advertising campaign that promotes solar energy? We like solar energy, don't we? That's a renewable technology. So we should be supportive of them putting money into those advertising campaigns. But my question is, if those companies are only spending 5% of their investment portfolio on renewable energies, should they be allowed to spend 95% of their advertising revenue pretending that that's what they focus on? Because you could very well argue, and indeed there have been cases, that is a form of consumer deception. And it creates the perception that they are working a lot more to support the net zero transition and support the EU's energy goals, national energy goals, than they are in reality. And one really interesting case study from last year was that HSBC, the bank in the UK, had an advertising campaign all about its green credentials and how invested it was in the green transition. And it was taken to the Advertising Standards Agency And it had to remove both of those campaigns because the ASA determined that it was misleading the public and therefore it was a form of consumer fraud. So that is my question that I kind of leave open for debate is, should we take more of an actor-based approach to advertising rather than a content-based approach to advertising? And would that really change the game going forward? Thank you very much.
Wow, da war jetzt so viel drin. Ich habe like a million questions.
There was so much in your presentation. I have like a million questions, but let's carry on with Alberto Alemanno. I'm very happy to present them to you. He's a Jean Monnet Professor of European Union Law in Paris and one of the leading voices on the democratization of the European Union. And he will be presenting to us what he suggests. He founded an organization called the Good Lobby, and that is his way of supporting the civil society. I'm very happy to have him here with us, and he'll be presenting to us the Good Lobby. Welcome, Alberto.
Thank you. Thank you, Maximilian. Hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here to share some thoughts and further unpacking the hidden and complex realities of the fossil fuel lobbying, corporate political activities that are clearly blocking progress. And I will be doing this from the perspective of my nonprofit, the Good Lobby, by basically saying and trying to be provocative in showing how on paper it is possible to use lobby also for positive meanings and also to counter the excesses that we have just heard. So what we do at the Good Lobby is really to demystify, beautify, and democratize lobbying as a legitimate form of participation. So we claim that in a world in which everybody, every voice, every interest would have the same access to power and to policymakers, we might potentially counter some of the practices we just heard. So although lobbying is carrying a very negative connotation, this is possibly because it has been monopolized by few actors, in this case, special interests representing the industry we no longer need. And we see that in reality, lobbying can actually be one of the most effective ways to induce change. That's what many jurisdictions in the world with climate action, also Germany in his own way is trying to do while engaging into ecological transition by basically changing the rules of the game and trying to facilitate and accelerating a transition that without new rules would not necessarily occur. Of course, this has never happened before in the whole history of humanity, so we need to be humble, but we need to be fast at the same time. We acknowledge at the Good Lobby that today the lobbying practices represent possibly the major obstacle. I call it the lobbying paradox. How is it possible that the phenomenon that on paper would allow us to actually solve most of our problems is actually the very same phenomenon that is blocking progress on a variety of issues, not only climate action, but also extractive industries all the way to tax abuse or tax circumvention. I think what we need to do today when discussing about the fossil lobby activity is to contextualize it within a broader trend which is emerging in our society and which is basically showing, and this is a possible good news, an unprecedented public scrutiny over corporate political activity. So never before, since the Industrial Revolution, the activities that all our industries are making, are causing to the planet and to the people are drawing some attention. And this attention is not only ours as a small group of engaged individuals who will certainly change the world, but also that of investors like asset managers, big players in the market who are becoming more and more aware that the way in which companies act today is basically affecting our life chances and those of our kids. So we have the investors scrutinizing, but we also have the employees getting a bit more attentive and more sensitive to what their companies are doing and saying, and certainly us as consumers when we walk by the supermarket shelves and we pick our brands and we clearly see a responsibility for our brands and for our companies to actually do much more than just delivering a service or producing or manufacturing a particular product. So, aha moment, all of a sudden, the social context of the business world matters. Again, first time since the Industrial Revolution in which CEOs, board members are expected to be accountable vis-a-vis their constituencies, well beyond the shareholders. So as we all know, since the 60s, there has been this dominant view of the role of companies, including fossil companies, to basically maximize shareholder value without any kind of attention to planetary boundaries or to the negative effects that they might cause on society. The best example is that every single product or services we buy today, its price doesn't reflect its true cost. We always pay much less than what we should, because many of the costs that were caused by the manufacturing of that product were simply not internalized. They were left to the planet. They were left to discriminatory practices or underpaid workers. So this is a good news. Scrutiny is mounting. As a result of this, we see more and more companies taking responsibilities for the environmental impact they might have and also to their social impact. You might say that not all companies do that, certainly not the fossil fuel companies, but we will see, and we already heard, that they are trying at least to make it appear as realizing that they can be part of the solution instead of simply being part of the problem. But what is interesting to observe is that now this attempt at internalizing the carbon footprint is becoming massive. It's not only about scope 1 emissions, so basically internalizing the cost for the emissions that were caused by the very same company, the energy used by the company to produce, not only that use for the various production methods used, but also along the supply chain, what we call scope 3 emissions. They're also becoming mandatory. So they are creating an obligation and clearly a disincentive to actually remain a client for the fossil fuel companies. It's not only the carbon footprint, it's also the social footprint, meaning that companies are under the DDD due diligence directive the European Commission is preparing. The European Union should actually be able to adopt, hopefully, if there won't be more pushback by the end of this policy cycle before the next European elections, to integrate all costs that are caused along the supply chain, along the production channel. However, there is one impact, and this is my major, I would say, message to you today, that is not necessarily internalized. There is one impact that is missing from this growing public scrutiny over companies. And that impact is what I call the political footprint, the fact that many companies are becoming greener and perhaps even more social, but they are certainly not internalizing the meetings they are having with the political leaders. They are not declaring the think tanks they are supporting. They are certainly not declaring the political contribution in order to push certain political leaders to perhaps embrace some of the denials that we've heard earlier on. And certainly they are not disclosing the trade association. So those groups that indirectly advance their bottom line interest when the company look very progressive, very liberal. This is extremely problematic, and this explains why today lobbying, or the lack of transparency and accountability and responsibility in the way in which companies are exercising their political power, is possibly the major factor that is preventing us from making progress here. Best example, best illustration, if you look at most recent data, the fossil fuel subsidies, meaning the amount of public money which is going to these big producers of fossil fuels, has been growing dramatically over the last few years. Definitely inflation, Ukraine, Russian invasion of Ukraine, the fact that at the end of COVID, there was clearly an intention of the public governments across countries to support consumers' spending, played a role in a constellation similar to the one that Jennie presented us, an incredible constellation. All these factors led public policies to be extremely generous with fossil fuel companies, and you can see that today their lobbying efforts certainly have paid off in an unprecedented manner. And this is clearly one of the most extraordinary facts after years and years in which awareness about the need for climate action is growing. We still see our governments transferring taxpayers' money in a greater amount to those very same companies. I think this is possibly the $6 million question, why this is happening, and it is happening without much scrutiny from public opinion, despite investors paying attention, despite employees paying attention, and despite consumers being more aware. And then there is a second, I would say, phase of this story, which is very much represented by what we often refer in the literature as the big decouple. So we see more and more companies, including fossil fuel companies, who are basically saying one thing, making investment, for instance, in renewable or in alternative or unconventional oil, while at the same time advocating for the exact opposite outcome when it comes to their lobbying outreach. So this is an example that comes from 2015, 2016, where you could see in the Washington Post, in the New York Times, plenty of big brands that you can see here buying an entire marketing page, an entire sponsor content page, basically calling the incoming Trump administration to remain in the Paris Agreement. Well, most, if not virtually all of these companies, all of these brands, they also happen to be a member of a trade association that, together with the US Chamber of Commerce, were proactively lobbying for the Trump administration to leave the Paris Agreement. And that's exactly what it happened, as you clearly see. This decoupling or this mismatch between what companies say and what they lobby for certainly represent one of the most neglected dimensions in our public policy conversation when discussing about climate change. I think this image coming from Influence Map, possibly the largest and most powerful and influential database on what companies say and what the company lobby for, give you a fantastic example. So since the Paris Agreement, a fossil company like ExxonMobil has been supporting a pretty green-sounding US proposal like the Americans for carbon dividends for the amount of 1 million, but in reality, it has invested 100 times more in order to oppose binding climate regulation and promoting its own industry. So this might remind you a little bit what Jennie said in relation to the marketing efforts. Here is no longer about marketing, but it's about lobbying efforts. So you put some lobbying efforts towards the good cause, towards a piece of legislation that might seem ancillary to all the rest, by making a lot of virtue signaling, by saying we are on the right side of history. Our company is no longer called BP, it's called Beyond Petroleum, for instance, but then investing or over-investing into lobbying efforts that goes exactly against that objective. This basically is telling us something very few of us are fully aware. In particular, we try to celebrate in our, I would say, progressive, possibly leftist community, those companies who are embracing a more progressive stance in celebrating those companies that are becoming greener and more social, without realizing that perhaps the way in which they behave politically is much more important than the contribution they might have at the planetary level, at the society level, if they would just embrace and use their political power in a wiser or at least in a more consistent way. What we see now, and I think this is possibly one of the most troubling aspects of the story of tonight, is the fact that today the state is not very well placed to capture the realities of lobbying. Countries around the world know very little about how fossil lobbies, how companies are using their corporate political power. And the reason for that is that over the years, we've been very prudent to introduce disclosure requirements for companies. That basically means that we don't know much about how many people do they employ as lobbyists? How many meetings do they organize? How they position themselves in relation to a particular policy issue? In other words, most of these corporate political activities remain hidden, or if they are declared as they are at the European level, now with the German lobbying regulation, which has recently been adopted, we might get a sense of the overall size. We might know how much a given company might be spending in lobbying, but this amount, 5 million euros per year, won't be telling us much. It's not granular enough to understand what kind of activities they were supported by a company. How much of this went into a think tank? How much of this went into an astroturf, meaning a fake group of activists Jennie was referring to? How much this is going towards the support of Annika's stories of denials that are also shaping the informational capacity of policymakers? Well, all this information is not captured. And basically, we see that these lobbying regulations tend to be very suboptimal by simply capturing a tiny, tiny bit of the realities of these lobbying activities. And here is the good news. The good news is that as a result of this paucity and limited ability of the state to capture the realities of lobbying activities, we see an entire ecosystem of third-party actors, non-profit, social change actors, foundations, academic and research institute, whose job is to do what we're doing together tonight, which is to hold accountable entities for the way in which they organize their lobbying activities. And needless to say, the fossil lobby is possibly the one that has attracted most studies, that has attracted more interest, because that's where this organization could actually maximize their impact by shedding light on a reality which is very little known. I already mentioned Influence Map as one of the leading organizations that has set up several databases, but the overall idea of Influence Map is to hold accountable companies for their own commitments toward the climate by measuring the consistency between what these companies are pledging to, being net zero by 2050, and their lobbying activities on a monthly basis. So they look at whether the lobbying that has been conducted, that is conducted on a daily basis by this company, is aligned to the milestones needed for that company to deliver on the net zero pledge. And as you can see from this picture, but there are many more images you can find available on free access on their website, there is a major misalignment between what companies are saying and their lobbying commitment. So by the simple fact of shedding light on this reality, Influence Map is already influencing investor choices, asset manager choices that might be departing from certain companies in order to be or look consistent vis-a-vis the rest of the world. We have other organizations that they do the same by targeting not investors, but in this case, employees. So what about the average employee of a fossil fuel company? Perhaps somebody who is very idealistic and is working on the little renewable department. Well, Climate Voice is telling those employees the real truth about the misalignment between that company, corporate political activities, and the statements of their CEOs, and generating this pre-made tweet that will be tagging the CEO, the CFO, and allowing the employees to keep track of what the company is particularly doing. And this is moving even further. This is a very North American activity. It's called Progressive Shopper. Is a browser extension that allow any of us, before making a particular shopping online, to know where that particular company stands. So in the US reality, how much that brand is giving to the conservatives, how much is giving to the Democrats, how diverse it is. In other words, shedding light this time on the actual brand political stance, what is the political footprint of that particular company. But the so-called accountability ecosystem when it comes to lobbying is much more diverse. So I gave you 3 examples that capture our imagination. They show you a new trend. They clearly lack scale. They won't be able to solve this structural issue, but they're certainly giving us a sense of where the world is going in terms of accountability. So here are certainly more well-established initiatives, much more market-driven than the one I briefly presented to you, which are basically providing guidance to many companies who are trying to not only act in a way which seems to be politically responsible, but also trying to increase their own transparency and accountability in the way in which they lobby the political powers. We have a variety of organizations here running from general guidance like the OECD all the way to the Corporate Disclosure Project or to the Global Reporting Standard. This is an initiative that started already more than 10 years ago that gives a guidance to big multinationals on how to do what we call non-financial reporting, including reporting on political activities. And then we have the richest category, which you have certainly heard about, which is called ESG data and rating providers, which are third-party entities, which in a very unaccountable way are basically collecting information about how companies behave, also politically. So it's not only about collecting non-financial reporting under the environmental aspect and the social aspect, but also under the governance one. And that's where they ask a lot of questions to companies. And this is a good news. It's a good news because we see that if the state is somehow missing out, being not granular enough in capturing the realities of those companies, we have companies like those, Moody's or Sustainalytics, MCSI, and others that are asking plenty of questions to every single company, including the fossil companies, about how they organize their lobbying activities. The problem we have with those initiatives is that they tend to be proprietary. In other words, their methodology is not accessible to everyone. However, being a researcher, I was able to get access to most of these methodologies and to see and to unpack the kind of questions they're asking. And I realized that there's a lot of potential. There's a lot of potential to understand what are the questions that investors are asking companies in order to create a sort of de facto standard for good lobbying that should be also applicable to fossil companies in order to increase the accountability level that exists today. Basically, the baseline is very low. But these ESG providers and the other initiatives I mentioned are de facto acting as guardians of the corporate political activities. So I find this troublesome again, that the market is ahead of the state when it comes to collecting data about the realities of lobbying activities. However, this is happening and we probably need to get the most out of it. And this is what is leading me to argue that at the end of the day, today, companies around the world, they are becoming more and more aware that their license not only to operate, but also the license to lobby, meaning the license to knock the door to politicians, is questioned. And there will be more policymakers who might no longer be willing to actually engage with them. And this is happening, is marginal, is ancillary, is very much driven by a new generation of politicians who can no longer afford to be caught meeting or exchanging with fossil fuel companies that are, as a result, stigmatized partly by the political process. This is clearly not happening all across the spectrum. We heard from Annika that we have clear political forces on the extreme rights that tend to be more open and certainly culturally closer to denialism when it comes to climate. But we see an important trend among mainstream parties to actually depart from business as usual and becoming more sensitive, or at least more attentive, before engaging with these traditional lobbyists whose major goal is simply to promote their self-interest. I'm coming to an end by basically highlighting what is the theory of change or the theory of action behind these actors. What all these actors from ESG to the NGOs like Influence Map and others want to do is to inject greater transparency into the system so as to push companies to reassess their political engagement. So we have some anecdotal evidence that suggests that an increased level of evidence around corporate political activities, in particular when you disclose these subtler forms of influence, which are not simply how many employees do you have lobbying for you, but are you transferring resources to AstroTurf companies? Are you transferring resources to think tank? Are you publishing your policy position before a public consultations? Are questions that are leading certain companies to reorganize their corporate political activities and potentially to adjust their own outreach in order to become more inclusive. This leads me to a final question, which is more like a question to be debated in the same way as Jennie asked you about the possible limits that we might want to impose on the marketing outreach of companies that tend to be inconsistent, or they are over-investing in the marketing of the right side while under marketing the core business. We might ask a broader question. Should fossil companies still be allowed to lobby in the first place? Should we extend what happened in the tobacco industry, where with the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control in 2005, we established globally the existence of an irreconcilable conflict between the industry and the policymakers that prohibit any tobacco representative to meet a policymaker, because this would be considered a situation of indirect conflict in that particular industry. There are more voices being raised these days, notably by the Green 10, so the leading green NGOs who have been pushing for a fossil-free politics in which not only tobacco, but also the fossil companies should be prohibited from entering this political space. And also in the agro-food business, we hear similar voices saying that in the nutrition space, also there would be an irreconcilable conflict and more prohibition should be created. So I leave you with this question. Has the time come to introduce some form of prohibition or regulations that might limit the political outreach of those companies, because perhaps shedding light on what they do might not be sufficient or at least quick enough to lead the transformations which are needed to actually engage into an ecological transition. I'm going to stop here. Back to you, Max.
Vielen Dank, Alberto.
Thank you, Alberto. So many new points. Just going to give you all the space to speak longer than we discussed, because many of the things you are saying are already answering questions that we have on Slido from the citizens. So it's working really well, and we'll still have time for some discussion. And now our next panelist is Christina Deck-Wirt. She's already from Alberto. She's already been introduced because he said so many organizations now taking a very critical look at lobbyists. So she is a political scientist working for just such a group. She represents the lobby critical organization Lobby Control in the organization's Berlin office vis-a-vis politics and the media. So Christina, we're looking forward to your presentation.
Wie hochkant ist.
The presentation, well, can we see it well? Can we see it the right way? That's the question right now. You have to start it.
Du hast sie mir geschickt, oder? Dann teile ich
If
sie.
not, I can share it for you.
Das ist Open Office manchmal.
Ja, ja, genau.
Sometimes when you're using Open Office, it doesn't really work. Oh, no. I thought I had it. Should I share it for you? Yes, please.
Ist wahrscheinlich am besten. Ich probiere noch.
That may be best.
Rede schon mal und ich hole deine Präsentation vor.
Just start speaking. Start your presentation, and I'm going to show the presentation. It's not so easy because I have so many slides, and then I'll have to tell you the next slide a million times. Well, anyways, despite the bad start, it's a little bit late, but now I can see my presentation at least. I think I'm going to talk about very concrete things. I'm going to talk about some of the campaigns that we have worked on or still working on in the area of fossil fuels. I work for lobby control, and I assume that not everyone knows us. So I would like to introduce us first of all. Next slide. Waiting for the next slide.
Nochmal. Sorry. Rede einfach kurz weiter. Ich versuche es hier zu
Go
fixen.
on, and I'm going to try to fix it. Well, yes, I work for Lobby Control, which is an organization that's part of that ecosystem that Alberto just introduced. And sorry, this one, yeah, that's the right slide. Just to an overview of what we're doing. We're a German organization, and we're based in Berlin and Cologne. We are also working on a lobbyism at the EU level, but our climate focus is really on Berlin. So we work on campaigns, we work for rules for lobbyism, and we have guided tours in the government quarter in Berlin, showing where all the lobbyists are based, close to the decision makers. So we're trying to combat unilateral influence and balanced and broad participation. We're working on balanced and broad participation of different social groups. We focus on influential lobbyists, and they've been named already. Corporations, associations, think tanks. And then one main point, a major focus of my work is to make those powerful alliances visible that try to inhibit climate protection measures. And of course, we're also looking at those kinds of policies that allow for these lobbying influences. So you have to look at it from both sides. Yes, there are lobbyists, the fossil lobbies or other lobbies for others areas, but there's also the other side, policies, scientists, media, the addressees of those influences, and how do they allow for this influence? How do they allow themselves to be influenced? Because then they actually they could also make sure that things are not more balanced, and they could also try to get influences from different sides and not just from one side. So we have been working for a lobbying register in Germany, and that was introduced last year, but it's not enough. We also want a sort of a lobbying track, like so that you can see not just who influenced, but also how they influenced. What were their contacts? What were the contacts between lobbyists and politicians? And what happens in ministries with statements, etc. And this is us in front of the German Reichstag. We were working for this sort of tracks for lobbyism. And then this is a photo for Fridays for Future demo where we were there with our messages, the common good instead of lobbying power. That's one of our main slogans or mottos. And also climate policy for everyone instead of just the privileged groups. So we're trying to name and shame as well. because it's also been said that sometimes it's not very clear who's behind the lobbyism because the names are misleading. So we're trying to get that clear. We're trying to make it clear who's behind all the lobbying and the influence, and combat this kind of influence. And then at the EU level, we've had this lobby register for a while, and we've been analyzing it for a while, and now we have it in Germany as well. So you can see that the 10 groups with the highest lobbying expenditure, there's a lot of automotive industry and also gas, Uniper, E.ON, etc. Gas and oil. So that lobby register helps us with seeing how much they're spending on lobbying, and also how they try to influence parties by means of donations. So we have these signs at party conventions, and we can see how many actors from the fossil fuel industry have given donations to a particular party. And then also contacts between politicians and fossil stakeholders. This is for our previous transport minister, Andreas Scheuer, but this is not something we can take from the lobby register. This is, we have to actually send a demand to Parliament for this. It's not easy to get this information, but we can see that they met, this minister, the transport minister, the previous one, met with the car industry, the automotive industry, 80 times, and only once with an environmental association during his entire period in office. And then we have think tanks, climate denial, that's very common. So we also inform about the background and networks, etc. And now I would like to focus on our current campaigns. The first one was a campaign on the topic of the car summit. It's kind of done. We started in 2020. The car summit is an event organized by the federal government where they are discussing the topic of mobility, it's said, but really it's just about cars, the automotive industry. And when you look at who's invited, it's very clear. So it's mainly the three major groups, automotive groups, the VDA, that's one of the biggest association in the area, and also the major trade union in the areas. But other modes like the Deutsche Bahn, etc., consumer associations, scientists, etc., are not invited. Also, no environmental organizations. So we have kept criticizing this, that the federal government regularly invites just automotive companies and just the automotive industry representatives to take these important decisions. And then in 2020, during COVID, the industry demanded a purchase premium for combustion engine powered cars, among other things, among other types of engines. So it would have been that kind of premium for any car. And that was a very strong demand. And it came during that very one-sided summit, and we started a campaign and said no COVID supports for the car lobby. They should not have the right of way. And we criticized the fact that other actors are not invited and their voices are not heard for such decisions. And then this was a decision that the car summit was then actually cancelled. So it was not just us, it was not just our work. There were environmental associations that were very active as well. So this amount of criticism in the public sphere, etc., led to the cancellation of this particular car summit, which encouraged us to continue and to demand to turn it into a mobility summit. We've kept criticizing that the car summit that was still taking place and said it should be turned into a mobility summit. And now finally in this current coalition agreement for this government, part of it was that the car summits were not going to continue as is, but were supposed to be mobility summits now. So end of the year, there was a mobility summit last year. It still wasn't completely balanced, but at least one environmental association was invited. So we're hopeful that these mobility summits are not going to be as one-sided as in the past, exclusively for the automotive industry. So it's another photo of the protests that we held in front of the Chancellery together with environmental associations about this one-sided summit. And that it was a good fit, many different actors coming together. And we were quite successful in making this public and getting a lot of publicity on the topic. That, of course, helped to gain some leverage against political decision makers here. Now, on to our next campaign that I wanted to show here. It was against a specific actor, namely the CDU Economic Council. The CDU, the Conservative Party of Germany, the Economic Council formally doesn't have anything to do with the party, but it still acts like a party body. And they even have a representative in the party executive. So this is our campaign sign. So it's often seen as an official party body, but formally it's not. And this Economic Council also works a lot on blocking climate protection measures. I brought you a couple of examples. Unfortunately, can't see them here. Well, they keep acting very clearly against climate protection or just promote things like e-fuels, something that the FDP was also promoting in order to prolong the life of the combustion engine. So they kept promoting things that were clearly inhibiting climate protection. And they are represented in the party executive. So I thought that maybe we have a legal recourse here because we got a legal expert opinion, and that helped us. So we went one step further with the help of a CDU member. We had the support and also the finances to actually bring a complaint against this body. And this is the court judgment, the decision by the court. Sorry, just let's stay on the slide. So that was the judgment. It was a partial success. The party court, that was the first court that we went to, said that the criticism was founded, but the complaint was rejected for formal reasons as inadmissible. So we're going to have to go to a public court, and that will bring a lot more publicity. We can be in the courtroom ourselves and not just have CDU judges making their decision on their own. So we've spread publicity about it and had a lot of feedback and made this connection visible between the Economic Council and the CDU. So naming and shaming really works well here. And we also spread it within the climate movement so that other groups from this movement keep bringing it up and protesting, etc. And so we were really happy that we were able to initiate this kind of protests across the climate protection movement. And now our newest, most recent campaign on the topic of gas. And this is against a lobbying association called Future Gas, Zukunft Gas. And it's an association by the public utilities, and they are, of course, responsible for energy supply locally. And on the topic of gas, we published a study just to show all the different actors of the gas lobby and show who are the stakeholders, what are their narratives, where are they obviously wrong, what are the networks and their connections, etc., their networks. What are the methods? The gas lobby, similarly to the automotive lobby, is very strongly presented in with politicians, and especially around heating. There's been a huge debate in Germany. If you're not from Germany, you might not know this, but so they're really working quite hard on expanding LNG terminals, and they're working against this ban on installing new gas heaters. And so we're trying to show the fossil interests and name the actors, because often it's not clear who's actually saying this. So in the debate, it sounds like the Green Party is trying to prevent us from having our normal heatings, but really, who's behind these claims? And it's often very powerful actors. And one of these powerful actors is that association, Zukunft Gas. And the name doesn't really make it clear what it is. It used to be Zukunft Erdgas, so future natural gas. The natural has now been scrapped. It's just future gas, because gas could also be hydrogen. And hydrogen is quite central to their work. They keep saying that hydrogen is the new and the biggest thing that means that we should keep our gas infrastructure. So we have big gas groups like Wintershall or Wingas, former Gazprom subsidiary, and public utilities, so about 80 of them. And Zukunft Gas is a lot of public relations work, marketing gas for the public and for politicians as something that's really future-proof. So they also have offers for utilities to finance campaigns for installing new gas heatings, gas boilers, and they also keep communicating hydrogen and the topic of hydrogen to utilities, so that these utilities then think, well, we don't have to change anything because people will just use hydrogen and use the same infrastructure. All right, I'm going to finish very soon. I'm almost done. So our campaign has the title that utilities out of that gas association. So we're asking them, the utilities, to leave the association, and we're driving local campaigns, working together with other organizations like 350, for instance. And the first protests have already started, for instance, in Frankfurt, where their own actors are asking their utility to leave this association. The first utilities have left. We're hoping that more will leave. And so it's about naming and shaming this lobbying association, but also weakening it by making utilities leave it. And so we can see that we're having first results here. And then I have some lessons learned on my last slide. Lessons learned. So in our campaigns, it's been very important to make the groups and their interests visible, so that we're going away from this sort of a narrative that it's a culture war, that the Greens and environmental activists want to take something from us, that's not what's happening. It's just big groups and their interests and spreading these messages. And then also we're trying to make it very visible where lobbies have privileged access to politics with politicians, and we are demanding changes, so stricter lobbying rules, or that such meetings like the CAR Summit either don't take place anymore or are changed completely. And another thing that works really well is have good cooperation with actors from environmental associations, but also the climate movement. So we have the content and they also take up the content and point out one-sided politics. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I'm really almost overwhelmed by the 4 presentations. That was really magnificent. And I would like to come very swiftly to the questions. The first question is the question that has been voted highest, and there are so many other questions connected to that. It's not about what the fossil lobby does, but the question by Matthias Schmitz is how can we break this influence of the fossil fuel lobbyists, and how can we upgrade our own lobby activities as Greens? How can we actually make progress in this sense? And the first English question from Chiara.
Message für unsere
Is there a positive message connected with this? Is there a positive narrative for our future activity? So what do we do? Should we try and be positive and draw some positive pictures, or should we simply enter into this war of cultures or find our own way forward? I think I'd like to start with Annika. Yes, I think we should combine the two. First of all, be positive, why not? And be constructive as we are in journalism, for example, so that we can portray a counter model. All this threat being hyped in Germany, that the government would prohibit heating and would take the property from the house owners, for example. But we can counter that by a narrative on positive developments. Like, for example, if we can prevent heat waves, if we can protect the citizens much better, if we can actually become more resilient to very strong rainfall, for example. I think that we should actually share the positive perspectives of fighting climate change. Let's not forever pretend that we live in the best of all worlds. There are so many people who are unhealthy, who are not happy at all, who are depressive, who don't have any belief in the future any longer. And we could actually share with these people a perspective of a life that can be enhanced, that can become much better again by taking climate action. And Alberto and all the other speakers also said that we would need more transparency, because the whole thing works much better if there is a total intransparency. Who is it who's telling me right now that e-fuels are the best, that the electro car is my best option? you really need to reflect on that. And I also thought that the idea of Alberto was very interesting when he said, should these companies still be allowed to market or to do commercials, publish commercials, for example? I think that is that's a justified question. And I think that if you cite from, or if you rather quote from a study, then you should also be more transparent about the authors. Jennie, I hope you're there. Jennie, can I ask you something?
Of course.
Great. What would be your take from a scientific view or a researcher's view? If you look at all these things, what works best against misinformation and disinformation? Would you offer pictures, or perhaps in a populist positive way? Or would you offer a narrative, a positive narrative? What is the strategy against this?
I would say a couple of different things, some which go far beyond climate. They're about the way that we engage with difference and with opposite opinions. But I'll try and lay out a few, some which are systemic and some which I think are the responsibility of every individual in the way that they talk to others, both on and offline. The first is that I think anyone who is a climate communicator has to be sober to the reality that we're currently living in, and the fact that we operate in parallel media universes, that we live in highly fractured information environments. And they need to go in with their eyes open whenever they're talking about a public policy and know that there are these overarching themes which are going to get weaponized. And those themes are ones around power, around government overreach, around citizen agency, around civil liberties. And it's really important to not constantly be making the same mistakes in not anticipating the attacks that are going to come. So part of it is around being smarter in the communications. And really, if you're talking about the climate justice agenda, for example, making that feel very contextual to people's real lived experiences. So, the issue is that mis and disinformation can use, it doesn't have to have any nuance, right? It can use these big catchphrases. It never has to have any scientific basis behind it. And on the other side, you have this very complicated, technical, quite confusing set of information about what the transition could look like, what are the best solutions, how is it going to affect people? And really what works best in some of the studies that I've seen, and this isn't work that ISD does directly, but is in trying to actually bring the conversation down to a much smaller local level. So rather than talking about climate change as a multilateral problem, or even as a national problem that's going to be kind of generational and feels really distanced, is that you talk about it in respect to a given community. So what would climate justice mean, practically speaking, or what would the net zero transition mean, practically speaking, for the people in this area? And you provide those human stories that ultimately give it shape and color and meaning. And that you try and sort of seize back some of these narratives that have been claimed by the mis and disinformation and the fossil fuel lobby around power, around equity, and say, how can it possibly be the case that the carbon economy is going to make life fairer when that's what we've had for the past 50 years and we're living in societies that are more unequal than ever? This is about re-empowering communities. This is about trying to decentralize who owns wealth, who is able to access natural resources, all of these things. So that's kind of a narrative steer. The second is that rather than waiting for the next line of attack to come, is to anticipate it and already begin what we call pre-bunking, or kind of arming the general population with as many tools to spot fossil fuel narratives or messaging or a form of mis and disinformation when it comes along. So don't wait for the hydrogen lobby to spend $1 billion, and suddenly you're operating on a completely unbalanced playing field, but instead already start educating people about the tactics of the disinformation playbook. What are the common rhetorical tools that they use? What are the common misperceptions? And you could do those in a number of different ways. You can, there are people who are doing that brilliantly in short form on TikTok, or who are doing it via images on Instagram. And there are others who are doing kind of crib sheets or explainers or very simple videos that say, here's the myth, here's the debunk, here's how to spot it, and how it can be shrouded in language which you might not realize is coming from the fossil fuel lobby, but is actually linked to a wider ecosystem of mis and disinformation. So don't wait for the lie to come out and then fact check it, because by that point it's too late. And fact checking there's a lot of mixed academic opinion about whether or not fact checking actually works, or whether it reinforces people in their own beliefs. Like if they read a piece of content and a social media platform applies a label to it saying this has been debunked, there is some evidence that people actually retreat further into that opinion because they don't like reading things and being told that it's been fact checked. So it's much better to get to people earlier in the process rather than trying to fight fire once it's already broken out. And then I think, one of the other things I would suggest is creating much more awareness and visibility about commentators who are bad faith actors or who are operating on behalf of the fossil fuel industry, but don't have a company name next to their bio, but who are platformed in all of the mainstream press, everywhere from, I'm not going to name outlets because I'm going to open myself up to a bunch of legal exposure, but, any mainstream outlet is to make it less comfortable for those people to be featured in conferences or to be used as analysts and experts on news segments, or to be quoted in articles. And there are outlets like DSMOG is a very good example that have really been trying to do that in building up databases that show the affiliations, both financial and ideological, between these people and the fossil fuel industry. And so I think kind of creating much greater awareness of saying, these pundits talk about themselves as being neutral or as being rationalists, but actually, look at where their financing is coming from, or look at the entities that they are formally associated with. They're not good faith actors, and they also don't have scientific background. And last of all, and I would urge this because I've seen this even happen on webinars, is acknowledge people's legitimate concerns and grievance. I think the biggest trap that the climate movement falls into, or indeed that the kind of liberal movements fall into, that political discourse falls into, is we're so nervous and we've become so anxious about mis and disinformation that if anyone expresses a well-meaning concern, we want to marginalize them or assume that they're part of a conspiracist movement. And actually, people really find this a very difficult topic to navigate. And lots of people care about climate change, but they also have very legitimate worries about, will they be able to pay their bills? Are they going to lose their job? Is this going to change their personal and professional lives in ways that they can't reconcile? And I don't think that it helps anybody to dismiss those as being anti-climate. You have to acknowledge that even within the net zero transition, there are going to be people who, in the short term, struggle more than others. And that by being candid about that, you're able to have a much more human conversation with people than saying, no, we can only talk about the positives, because otherwise, the bad actors win.
Mhm. Great. Okay, wunderbar. Und das gebe ich jetzt direkt mit der nächsten Frage weiter an Alberto, weil was Annika auch schon angesprochen hat, was Jennie auch angesprochen hat, ist hier die Rolle der Medien. Und genau, die Rolle der Medien und eben gerade die Frage,
the role of the media this is a legitimate concern. Jennie just said it. This is a public interest, obviously, and we will see that media play a huge role in spreading mis and disinformation. But looking at democracy on the whole, and you are a professor for democratic processes, what do we do if the yellow press, for example, follows a disinformation campaign? How do you defend your legitimate interests? What would be the reply from a democratic perspective?
Thank you, Max. Well, this is a big question. It's pretty clear that today we don't have the informational space we would need to advance an informed conversation about the many trade-offs that exist across the political spectrum. Let me take a case study, which I think remains the most powerful case study that comes from the Yellow Vest movement in France, which gave us a bit of a test case for the difficulties to have an informed conversation. Building on what Jennie said, what most of these proponents of the Yellow Vest were saying was absolutely legitimate. The distributive cost coming from this policy, basically a sudden increase in the gasoline, was affecting one specific segment of the French population. And those individuals, they were able to organize, they were able to mobilize the public debate. Unfortunately, they also embraced violence in these particular circumstances, because that was the only way to change the conversation and to make sure that the trade-off that was not considered initially by the government, the fact that any form of taxation has a regressive nature, meaning that it costs more to those who have an available income which is less, it was simply unfair. And it cost the yellow vest to happen for the French government to acknowledge that and to actually enter into an entire new dynamic that somehow acknowledge that fact. Did we learn from the Yellow Vest? Well, yes and no, because this was very contingent to that particular circumstances. And what the French government at the time had to do was to establish this grand débat and to basically start a listening exercise in order to create at the micro scale a more informed debate. That's why we are seeing a lot of deliberative processes, citizens panel across Germany, across the UK, across France, and spreading all around Europe, all around OECD countries and beyond, because both policymakers and citizens realize the need to create a deliberative space, which is clearly not guaranteed by our informational system. So what a paradox that we are not able to have a global conversation about policy trade-offs, and we need to recreate these mini publics, that's the name in the literature, that basically create artificially the conditions for seeing what the experts say about a particular issue and what citizens react. And being citizens, meaning the members of the citizens panel being randomly selected, they tend to be more representative than our political class. So is this a solution? I see a lot of interest in identifying this complementary way of representative democracy, but I also see a slippery slope of jumping onto a patchwork of solutions that are still not structurally solving the problem, which is to allow everybody to have an opinion that will then be making the government responsive. So possibly we're taking a couple of shortcuts without really tackling the problem there.
Vielen Dank. Und dann jetzt nochmal Annika dazu, zur Rolle der Medien. Das würde mich ja auch interessieren.
And then Annika, on the role of the media, because you worked a lot on that, also for Die ZEIT and Correctiv, these two publications. And other media houses have a very different stance. So how should politics deal with this, and other journalists? Well, so I'm supposed to start bashing my colleagues. That's not a very easy role to play. Well, yes, it is an issue. We've mentioned this heating discussion in Germany, which is quite a heated discussion in Germany at the moment, even if you don't know about it. It's about a ban on new oil or gas heaters. And the campaign against it started in the Bild Zeitung, Axel Springer publishing house. That is, I think they have 800,000 readers per day. They're still the most influential newspaper in Germany. And for a time, there were daily reports about how terrible this ban was going to be, and they had all these sob stories of poor people, allegedly poor people, who would suffer terribly. They would basically be robbed of their heating, and they would just remain without heating and under this new law. So that was one of the main campaigns. But of course, you can't just go to the Bild Zeitung and tell them to write something else. So I think what Jennie said just now is more important, that you start debunking things in advance. And Herbig and the government and myself too, we were quite surprised when this campaign came. But we all know that sometimes little things can really trigger massive campaigns, like one veggie day per week. That was something the Greens supported, and it was a massive campaign. And now we have this heating ban. And we know that the conservative press, or the right-wing populist press, and that publications like the Bild Zeitung, the Welt, etc., will embrace such campaigns again and again. And we know, after what was written in the Zeit, that the CEO of the Welt and Bild, that he was a fan of climate change, because it would be quite nice when everything's a little bit warmer. So I don't think they'll change in the next few years. They'll keep really writing every possible campaign against climate measures. So all we can do is just try to have the better strategy, to have the better examples, the more positive examples, how this will benefit all of us. And then at the same time, as Jennie said, for instance, France, the yellow vests, that we take their fears and anxieties seriously, and also talk about this. And then the gap between rich and poor, which is the basis for all of this, that when you hear climate protection, you always think about the nurse commuting 30 kilometers to work. So really, that is the main problem for any climate measure, that poorer people might suffer more because they can't afford the extra expense, if there is one. And that, of course, is a major task that no government has successfully tackled in Europe. But if that was successful, that if we had a better redistribution of wealth and a smaller gap between rich and poor, then these campaigns wouldn't gain ground so much. Yes, and somebody else also said that the biggest mistake would be to think that climate policy is a social justice policy. It's not that. It is climate policy. And at the same time, you need accompanying social measures. And that's what Jennie showed as well in her diagram, cost of living crisis, so rising living costs, that really helps such campaigns. We're out of time. It's 9 o'clock. And we've had 2 hours, but I would really like to ask Christina now at the end, because you said that you had some successes with more transparency for lobbyists. We have a lobby register in Germany now, and in some federal states in Germany, we have these tracks, lobby tracks. So looking at a crystal ball, could you subscribe to what Alberto said, that the more transparency really brings active changes? Do you see any changes because of more transparency? Do you see that positive in the future? relatively. But the lobby register in Germany is very new. We've just done our first few analyses, and the gas study was our first major analysis using this register for one particular sector. So maybe it's a little bit early to say whether that's successful or not. But for us, from the point of view of an NGO, it's just really valuable to have a clearer view on who the major actors are. So for our gas research, it was important to find out who the relevant players are in terms of associations and companies. And of course, the same is true for journalists, that they can have access to this information easily, to have access to any information, who is spending how much for what. And then if in the future you can see after a specific law or before a specific law where lobbying expenditure is on the rise, then that would also be interesting to see who's working against which bill, let's say. So I'm optimistic, let's say, that it will have an effect, but it hasn't had one yet. But if we're adding the lobby tracking as well, then, and we know who is meeting with whom, then I think we'll have the transparency to observe lobbyists better and keep a check on them. I think that's our final word. We could have talked a lot more. I'm sure this is not our last event on the topic, because it's one of the major topics to really define how do we want to communicate as citizens, NGOs, scientists, etc., politicians, to really counteract this major narrative. So we've started this discussion, and I think there's much more to say. And we'll have 2 more webinars for Europe Calling soon, Jutta Paulus tomorrow, and another one with Sven Giegold and Luisa Neubauer next week. I've put it in the chat, and that's my recommendation. But now I would like to thank everyone for joining us, our audience, our wonderful panelists. Thank you for taking the time. And then the speakers also thanking the interpreters. Until next time, enjoy your evening.